Hi, and welcome back again. We're kind of doing a little more indicators of things here on the painting here and there on this little owl painting that you've been following along with us on. Basically, again, I'm sort of making indications of things in somewhat of a loose interpretation. I'm not really worried about a lot of detail. Again, I'm going to say that until it's really time to really talk about bringing up the detail. But I just kind of want to stress that with people, but sometimes they can over agonize about the finished aspects of a painting before it's really time. You've got to kind of develop some patience with it. And you can see right now that down here I'm working. Earlier I put in some indications of what those tail feathers might begin to look like without drawing them, fully. I started putting them in there. But one of the things that I've noticed right off the bat with it is that the value here was getting too close to these dark colors that I first had in this foreground. So what I'm doing is that I'm letting the darkness of this contrast, and because it's closer, I want this to be more crisp image-wise. I'm bringing in some color that is lighter for that tail piece of that owl to sit against, so that you can clearly see that pop forward when I do that. And that's just by color choice. That's not, real fancy. It's not, but you can see that made a difference just in those couple minutes, where that tail is much more evident now, or it just kind of pops out a little nicer. That's all just by controlling the color, so that you get nice contrast. And I'm just going to keep ticking in some little details and different color variations in this to kind of break it up and to give it a real woodsy feel around this owl. I'll put in some tree tops of some little alpines that are probably creeping in here and there among this hardwood, which is kind of what we have a lot of around here these days in our forests. We have this kind of unusual sort of relationship between the trees we find with our logging operations, that when we take a lot of hardwood out, when we harvest hardwood, that quite often you think, okay, well, trees grow back, that'll be back again someday. But what happens is that an area becomes predominated by softwoods that come in where hardwoods used to stand. So a lot of our woods that we see out there, if you really look at them, you'll see that there's sort of these transition areas between pine areas and hardwood areas. So it'll look like the forest is really mixed. But when you harvest in a pine area, a lot of times hardwood will come back in if you let nature take its own course, and vice versa, that the pines will come in and the conifer trees will come in rather than the hardwood trees that were once standing there. So this piece of the woods, you could probably say, is okay. That's either on a transition line or somewhere on a fringe part of the forest. That's where a lot of our wildlife really exists too, is that on the fringe. Our deer are the same way, is that if it weren't for farmlands, deer would not be as healthy. They're not really suited for living in the deep forest like many of us think that they would be, because they need those fields. They feed off of them quite regularly, and they graze off of the grasses. So deer, much like an animal that hunts, like this one, is going to be more in the fringe part of the forest, where it can have the mixed habitat because of what that habitat brings in food-wise. Mice going for grain and mice going for corn makes an owl living on the edge of the forest more likely than really in the very depths of the forest. It's kind of something to note. So we try to put that little detail in. Again, following nature. Again, I'm going to back out on that. I don't want to overdo it and take out all of the hardwood possibilities that are developing there. I do want it to be mixed. And in the background here, where I'm showing some of the conifers treetops, you can see that I've kind of decreased the intensity of the color, and I'm letting that kind of gray in a little bit, letting the color bleed out of that like it naturally would happen if we were looking at it live in nature. I'm just going to keep dabbling here a little bit and bring that up. I think I want to go to a little liner brush here and indicate some branches a little more clearly here and there. Now, one thing I want to pay attention to too that I'm going to bring up, it's just it's good to know as you're painting a painting that you need to pay attention to certain things, and that's light source. That consistently through the whole piece we have to make sure that our light sources come from the same place and the same angles, and it's a real common mistake and an easy thing to make a mistake on. So that's why I'm going to bring it up, because we're going to start making sure that we're consistent. Let's assume that in this painting for today that the sun is somewhere up in this area where my fist is. I don't know if you can see that quite right, but out here. So from that same light source, I have to have that reflect on everything in this painting from that same one point of light. And that becomes important when we do the shading and the detail later, when we do the highlight, that all parts of that painting have to come back to that same rule of where that light source is, where the sun is in my imagination in this painting. That will dictate where all the shading and all the highlights go. And when it's done right and consistently, it makes the painting look so much more real, because it's consistent with what nature does and it's not broken up. So again, even though it's usually more of a high detail thing, I'm going to start putting in just indications of light and dark, of where some of those highlights might actually be. Again, I'm not really drawing bark on this tree yet. I'm just doing more underpainting work than anything. Just colors that are going to be under it when I actually do the finished work. But you see where these little highlight lines are going in, what that does automatically. If you remember, I was just saying about the where the light source is that it ties it in. It makes it make sense. So we might see a tick of light out here. Oh, out here a little bit. Maybe less so where the tree bends away from the sun. Not so much there.